You probably have a dozen things you consider private. A password, an embarrassing playlist buried 3 folders deep, a browser history you'd take to the grave before you'd share it with anyone who actually knows you. And that feels modern, right? It feels like a U-shaped problem, a product of living in a world with algorithms and social media and the particular anxiety of being perceived. Privacy feels like something we invented along with apartments and curtains and the concept of a locked door. Here's the thing, it isn't. The behavior you're performing right now, the management of what other people know about you, the careful curation of your visible self versus your actual self, that behavior is older than your species, older than language, older than fire probably. We have documented evidence of deliberate information concealment in primates, and our shared evolutionary branch with chimpanzees goes back roughly 6 million years. 6 million. That's not a rounding error. That's a number so large it makes every human civilization look like something that happened last Tuesday. So what actually is privacy, stripped down to its bones? Not the legal definition. Not the philosophical one, the behavioral one. Because the behavioral definition is where it gets genuinely strange. Privacy is really just this: information or space that you control and others don't. That's it. That's the whole architecture. Which means, and here's the part that should shift something slightly, privacy doesn't require a door. It doesn't require a password. It doesn't even require walls. It requires only that you have something you're choosing not to share, and that you're actively managing that choice. Chimpanzees do this. Documented, deliberate, not accidental. Male chimps who are lower in the dominance hierarchy have been observed concealing erections from dominant males, physically positioning themselves, turning away, using their own hands, specifically to avoid triggering aggression. They are, in a very real sense, managing their private information in a social context where the wrong disclosure has consequences. The stakes are immediate. The concealment is intentional, which means the gap between your carefully curated social media presence and your actual inner life, that gap has a 6 million year pedigree. The chimp didn't invent it, neither did you. Both of you inherited it. Now push the timeline back further, way further. It's roughly 60,000 years ago, and somewhere in what is now northern Iraq, a Neanderthal has died. The people around him, his group, his band, the 20 or so people who were his entire world, they don't leave him where he fell. They dig. They place him in the earth. And here's the part that stopped researchers cold when they found the site. A cave called Ea-Nasir. The body was buried with flowers. Pollen from at least 8 different plant species, some of them with known medicinal properties, clustered around the remains in a pattern that doesn't happen by accident. Someone chose those flowers. Someone had a specific idea about what this particular person deserved to take with them. That's a private interior life. Not a social one, not a communal one, a private one. The belief that an individual has a self that persists, that matters, that is worth marking. You can't bury someone with flowers without first believing that the person was a someone. And it doesn't stop at Ea-Nasir. Across Neanderthal and early human burial sites, archaeologists keep finding the same pattern. Personal ornaments, pierced shells, ochre-stained beads, carved bone, placed with individual bodies, separated from the communal tools and communal objects buried elsewhere. These weren't group possessions, they were personal ones. Someone owned these things alone, in a world where almost nothing was owned alone. Think about what that requires. In a band of 20 to 40 people sharing food, sharing fire, sharing every waking hour in close physical proximity, someone still had objects that were theirs, not ours, theirs. The concept of personal property, the thing we now encode in passwords and property law, and the very particular anxiety of someone touching your phone without asking, that concept is at least 60,000 years old, and probably much older. The flowers at Ea-Nasir weren't a statement about community, they were a statement about one specific person, irreplaceable, individual, gone. That's not a modern feeling, that's just a feeling. So was privacy just impossible in the ancient world? A band of 20 to 40 people sharing one fire, one shelter, every meal and every illness and every argument in full view of everyone else? Not exactly. Picture Çatalhöyük. It's a Neolithic settlement in what is now central Turkey, occupied from roughly 9,500 to 7,500 BCE, one of the earliest large human settlements we've ever found, home to as many as 8,000 people at its peak. Archaeologists spent decades excavating it, and what they uncovered was genuinely strange. The buildings had no doors, no ground-level entrances at all. The only way in or out of any house was through a hole in the roof, accessed by a ladder. Think about what that actually means. To enter someone's home, you had to climb up onto the roof, find the right hole, and descend into it. You couldn't just wander in. You couldn't drift past and peer through a window. Entry was deliberate, visible, and required a specific physical act of permission. The architecture itself enforced a boundary that no wall or lock was needed to create. And inside those rooftop entry homes, the spatial arrangement gets even more deliberate. Sleeping platforms were positioned in consistent orientations, the same placement across hundreds of houses, with hearths located to create distinct zones within a single shared room. Clean areas, dirty areas, sleeping areas, working areas. Microgeographies of personal space, carved out of what looks from the outside like one undifferentiated room. This is what humans do when they can't have a door. They make the space do the work instead. They orient the furniture. They establish which corner is yours and which is mine. In a settlement where 8,000 people are stacked so close together, the rooftops are essentially a second street. The architecture isn't incidental. It's a record of what people needed badly enough to build around. 8,000 people, one hole in the roof. Somehow, privacy. Here's a fact that sounds made up but isn't. Every known human culture on Earth practices sexual privacy. Every single one. Across every continent, every level of technological complexity, every social structure anthropologists have ever documented, humans consistently seek concealment for sex. The universality is so complete and so consistent that researchers treat it as a species-level behavioral marker, the same way they'd treat bipedalism or language. Bonobos don't do this. Chimps mostly don't either. Our nearest living relatives, who share roughly 98.7% of our DNA, are largely indifferent to audience. They're not embarrassed. They're not strategic about it. They're just getting on with things in front of whoever happens to be nearby, with the serene lack of self-consciousness of an animal that has never once considered how this looks. And then there's us. The gap between bonobo behavior and human behavior on this specific point is one of the more quietly strange things in all of evolutionary anthropology. Because it isn't explained by simple modesty or cultural programming, it appears to predate any specific culture. The seeking of concealment seems to be baked in at a level deeper than custom, which raises the obvious question. Why? What selection pressure made privacy around sex not just common, but universal? The honest answer is we don't know with certainty. Several hypotheses exist: pair bonding stability, reduced male competition, parental investment signaling, but none of them is settled. What we do know is that the behavior is ancient enough and consistent enough that it almost certainly wasn't invented. It was inherited. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Anyway, which means somewhere in your deep evolutionary past, an ancestor made a choice, or had an instinct, which amounts to the same thing, to step away from the group, to find a different place, to create, with nothing but their own movement through space, a boundary between their private life and their communal one. No door required, just the decision to walk a little further from the fire. Let's go beyond the physical for a moment, beyond the rooftop entrances and the buried ornaments and the deliberate walk away from the fire. Because there's a layer of privacy that's harder to see in the archaeological record, and in some ways more consequential than any of the others. Anthropologists call it impression management. It's the gap between what you actually feel and what you allow your face, your voice, your posture to show the people around you. And in a Paleolithic band of 20 to 40 people, the same 20 to 40 people, every single day for your entire life, that gap wasn't a social nicety. It was a survival technology. Here's the weight of that. Exile from a small band in the Paleolithic wasn't an inconvenience. It was, in almost every practical sense, a death sentence. You needed the group for food, for warmth, for protection from predators, for help when you were sick or injured. The group was the difference between living and not living, which means the emotional face you showed the people around you, the self you allowed to be visible, was something you managed with your life on the line. Your interior life, in that context, becomes something you actively protect, not out of embarrassment, out of necessity. And then there's the cave art. This is the detail that genuinely stopped me when I first encountered it. The most elaborate Paleolithic paintings, the ones at Lascaux, at Chauvet, at Altamira, are not near the entrances. They're not in the communal spaces where people gathered and slept and cooked. They're in the deepest, most inaccessible chambers, hundreds of meters from daylight, in passages so narrow you'd have to crawl through them with a lamp. Spaces that show no evidence of regular habitation. Spaces that, in some cases, appear to have been visited only once. Someone went there alone, or nearly alone. They brought light into the dark, and they made something in a place where almost no one would ever see it. You can't excavate a thought. Consciousness doesn't fossilize, but you can find a painting at the end of a tunnel and ask yourself why it's there and not somewhere easier. The answer that keeps suggesting itself is the same one you'd give today, because some things aren't for everyone. Writing changes everything. Not because it invented private thought. We've established that private thought is ancient, but because the moment humans started encoding language into physical objects, they immediately started encoding secrets and complaints, mostly complaints. One of the oldest letters ever recovered is a Mesopotamian clay tablet from roughly 1750 BCE. A merchant named Ea-Nasir had sold someone copper ingots of genuinely terrible quality, and the buyer, a man named Nanni, was not going to let that go. He wrote a letter. A furious, specific, formally structured letter detailing exactly how badly had been treated, demanding restitution, and making clear that his reputation was on the line and Ea-Nasir should be ashamed of himself. The tablet still exists. You can look at it. It is, in every meaningful sense, the world's oldest customer complaint. What nobody talks about is the other side of that transaction. The fact that Nanni wrote it down at all means he expected it to be read privately by Ea-Nasir, not announced in a public square. The clay tablet was a closed communication, a private channel. The concept of a message intended for one specific person and no one else is right there, baked into the oldest written records we have. And then there are the ostraca, broken pieces of pottery used as writing surfaces in ancient Egypt, cheap, disposable, everywhere. Archaeologists find them constantly, and what's written on them is not official record keeping. It's gossip, love poetry, workplace grievances. One ostracon from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, dating to roughly the 13th century BCE, contains what appears to be a private note between two people conducting an affair, written on a fragment of broken pot and almost certainly never meant to be archived for 3,000 years. 3,000 years later, here it is anyway, which is its own kind of privacy violation, honestly. Every cave painter who descended into the dark, every Neolithic villager who climbed in through the roof, every person who pressed a stylus into wet clay and addressed it to one person and no one else. They were all doing the same thing, drawing a line between the self that faces the world and the self that doesn't. The medium kept changing. The need never did. So come back to you, right now, wherever you are. You've got a password somewhere, probably several, an embarrassing playlist buried under a name that gives nothing away, maybe a browser history you'd genuinely rather not explain, maybe a desktop folder with a very innocent-sounding name that is absolutely not innocent, a thought you had today that you didn't say out loud, not because it was wrong, but because it was yours. That instinct, the one that made you create the folder, choose the name, keep the thought, is not a neurosis. It's not a symptom of modern alienation or digital anxiety or any of the things we like to diagnose ourselves with. It's a behavior so old it predates your species. The chimp who turned away from the dominant male, the Neanderthal whose shell beads went into the ground with them and no one else, the person at Catalhuyuk who climbed down through the roof into a space arranged exactly the way they wanted it, the painter who took a lamp into the deepest chamber and made something in the dark that almost no one would ever see. Every single one of them had a private life, not despite living in close quarters with other people. Because of it, the closeness is what made the privacy necessary. The group is what gave the individual self something to protect itself from and something to belong to. Those two things were never opposites. They were always the same tension, held together, managed daily, passed down through 6 million years of primate inheritance until it landed, unbroken, in you. The self that faces the world and the self that exists only for you, that gap is not a modern problem. It's not a bug. It's the oldest feature of human consciousness we can actually trace, and it runs from a cave in northern Iraq to a locked folder on your laptop without a single interruption. You didn't invent your private life. You inherited it. And somewhere in a museum in London, Nanni's clay tablet is still furious about those copper ingots, addressed to one person, opened by everyone, which is, when you think about it, a very familiar feeling.